Hello and welcome to this new video. Today we're going to talk about the Taki Oncoy, a indigenous messianic revolution movement that emerged in Peru in the Andes of my country in the 16th century, just a few years after the arrival of the conquistadors. We're going to understand why this revolution emerged, the reasons, what they were trying to achieve, and more. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you can, please subscribe to this channel for receiving also notifications of the upcoming events, activate the bell, and enjoy the next video. Don't forget to share with me your comments about this event, and also you can join my upcoming events live on heygo.com. You can also access to my upcoming live tours in the link that I'm leaving in the description below. I hope you enjoy the video. See you in a moment. So today's event is part of my Untold History series. Also, soon next week, I'm going to be bringing a new series, a new chapter, let's say, of a series I call Mysteries of Peru. So if you are interested in learning about mysterious topics, please come to my next event also next week as well. So today's event is about the Taki Oncoy, and this was a movement that emerged in the 16th century. It was a response to the terrible mistreats the indigenous were receiving from some Spanish. Of course, we are not talking about all the Spanish conquistadors or all the priests or all the monks. We're talking about some people who abuse of the indigenous, which were not really a small number. We're talking about a big number of people who abuse of them. And also, what was the indigenous response in front of these terrible treatments? The words Taki Oncoy, which come from Quechua. Quechua was the Frank language of the Incas. The Incas did not invent Quechua, by the way. They used Quechua because it was already a spoken language in a vast territory of the territories that they were conquering that became eventually the Tahuantinsuyo. That was the name of the Inca Empire when the Spaniards came to Peru, to the Incan territories in the 16th century. They found that the Incas were very well spread over. So this spreading of the Incas happened in about less than 100 years, really in few decades. So this empire was not completely solidified, and that also played against the Incas when the Spaniards came here. But I'm jumping a little bit in the history. So basically, the words Taki Oncoy mean in English the disease of the dance, in Spanish, enfermedad del baile. So the movement of the resistance of the indigenous was connected also with the intentions of the indigenous people, the Incans. Still, we're talking about Incas because we're talking about a first generation or a second generation that were here under the domain of the Spaniards, because we are still in the 16th century, that continue also practicing their faith secretly, their religion secretly. So they were responding, going back to their traditions, to their Incan beliefs, which were banned, which were forbidden. Also, when we talk about Taki Oncoy, we have to talk about the ways how these ceremonies were conducted. Usually refer to events in which people were dancing frenetically, in which they were moving, were dancing very strong, even shaking, trembling. So this is also another way of interpretation of the very name of the movement, the disease of the dance, a very strange dance that was made during the ceremonies of the association of the people who were standing in reveal. So before the year 1532, Peru and most of the Americas was completely different land, of course. So we're going to do a little revision of how was Peru before this year. And this year is the year when the Spaniards, led by Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador of the Spaniards, started the domination of this land. So before 1532, Peru was a land of diverse societies. We had not just one society. We had not just the Incas. The Incas were the group that were sort of like in control of most of the territory, but there were also many different religions, many different groups, the Chimus, the Chancas, the Chachapoyas. So we are talking about not just an even land, but what we can see is in common that the pre-Hispanic societies used to be worshippers of natural forces. And the most important deities for these indigenous people, for my ancestors, were the sun, were the moon. Most of the ancient societies of these territories were worshippers of the sun because, of course, these were agricultural societies. So they considered the sun was the one who gave life, nourished the soil, and the one also that permitted the agriculture. These ancient societies, which were worshippers of the moon, the sun, were also worshippers of other many deities, which we're going to be talking about some of them during this event. But, well, the idea is, first of all, to give you a scenario of the different gods that the Incas had. They were polytheists, so it means that they had several different gods. And the Inca, when we talk about the Inca culture, there was a king, the Inca king. He was the son of the sun, the son of God's son, pretty much like, for example, in Christianity, the idea of Jesus. Now, Jesus is the Son of God, made human, made flesh. So it was the same idea with the Incas. The Incas were direct descendants of Sun God. They were also the head leaders of the church, meaning that they were sort of like a pope. And they were also kings, the rulers, right, the absolute monarchs of these territories. And because there were these very important persons, like three persons in one, right? They couldn't, for example, touch the floor. The soil was dirty, so they could not touch it, and that's why they were carried in litters by several, let's say, people who were like workers for the Inca, the vassals of the Inca. We know, for example, that when the Spaniards first met Atahualpa, the last Inca king, free Inca king of our territories, because the next kings Inca were sort of like puppet kings, he was carried by 80 vassals and 80 persons. So the Incas who died were carried as well in litters in ceremonies, in special ceremonies. For example, a few days ago, we celebrated the winter solstice here in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere is the summer solstice. So in this moment of the year, for indigenous people of Peru, for the ones that continue carrying our Inca traditions, we celebrate the sun, and it's the moment of the new sun, right? It's the moment when the sun is the farthest from planet Earth. So we are bringing the sun again back to us with ceremonies, with lots of important, let's say, parades. So in the pre-Hispanic times, this was the period when the mummies of the Incas were taken out from their homes, their palaces, in parades, which were really, really beautiful, very well elaborated, in which their mummies were shown to everybody. So these different parades that were conducted with lots of, let's say, ceremony, were eventually substituted with other ceremonies after the coming of the conquistadors. This is the way how the mummies look in the times of the Incan rule. Probably this was the way how these mummies also were kept in their palaces, the people who took care of the mummies were the panacas, or the family of the Inca. So it means that when the Incas died, they were not just, gone. Like this is the same, this is the idea we have nowadays. When someone dies, of course, spiritually it can be with us, but it's not present in person. In the Inca times, it was different. And even before the Inca times also was the same. The dead were kept and were given respect and were fed also, and the family of the Incas who died took care of the Inca in their palaces. So we had several different rulers pretty much at the same time. And in this image from the colonial times, you can see that there is also a procession in which we have a group of indigenous people. For example, over here, you can clearly see the indigenous Inca descendants participating of a religious Catholic ceremony, and we have lots of images taken out in procession, including, for example, the image of Virgin Mary. She look at the form of the body of the Virgin, very triangular. She looks like a mountain, right? So the idea of the Virgin looking like the mountain, and also the concept the indigenous had about the Mother Earth, Pachamama, that also was represented or was connected with the mountain. They clear in the mind of people, like they started to believe that the Virgin Mary was the same, like Pachamama, and this confusion became eventually beneficial for the Catholic Church, because the indigenous sort of like converted massively, because they understood that Virgin Mary was the goddess they knew before, which was Pachamama. This is an image from the Republican times after the independence, after 1821. The celebrations continue, and now we still have these processions in which we have images of saints also taken in litters. Pretty much the same way how these ceremonies took place or happened in the Inca time, in the times before the Spanish conquest, right? There was not big difference. I'm jumping a little bit in the history just to give you an idea that this pre-Hispanic ceremonies, the way how we worship our ancestors, still continues, but now transformed into a more like a Catholic way, like worshiping not the mummies, worshiping instead Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary, right? So the times before the coming of the completely different in terms of religion. Here I have some notes for you just to give you an idea of how the religion used to be. For example, we have the gods of the Incas. There were many gods. Some documents even mention that we had over 600 gods in the Inca pantheon, right? So several different gods. And which gods existed in the pre-Hispanic times? Which ones were the gods of the Incas? So first of all, we know that the Inti, number one, the Inti was the god sun, right? And Quilla was the wife of Inti. Quilla was the moon. We have the estrella, Chasca, the star. We have Illapa, the ray. We have the Mamacocha, which was Mother Ocean, or could be also the lakes were considered Mamacocha. Cocha is related with the water. Pachamama, Mother Earth. We worship the mountains, we worship the lagoons, we worship the glaciers, we worship the caves. And some of these elements, natural elements that were special, that were seen really, really strong formations, natural formations were called huacas. So huaca means shrine, a holy place. Huaca is a site that is considered to be a connection point with the gods. But also we call nowadays huaca the archaeological site. So when we go to an archaeological site, usually in Peru, not just in Lima, you will see that the name of the place is Huaca. So we also call huacas the temples. And also huacas could be people, could be people that were touched by a lightning, for example, and were chosen therefore by the god ray, and if they were able to survive, of course, such event, so they became immediately wakas, sort of like priests as well. We have the malkis, which are the mummies, which, as you know already, were protected, cared, never destroyed, of course. There was a cult of to the dead, very, very intense in Peru. We have different type of people who were the ones who mediate with the gods, with the wakas. For example, I have here some cases of these priests. We have, for example, the Wakay Biyak, which was the one who protected the wakas, the sanctuaries, and the one who took care of the sacrifices. We have the Malki Biyak, which was the person who talked to the dead, the Livia Biyak, who was the one who talked to the lightning, to the natural powers, forces of nature, or the Punchay Biyak, the one who talked to the sun, right? So even the bodies of past or deceased children, for example, in the case of the ones who were born standing in a standing position and unfortunately died, miscarried, they were also kept and considered very, very special. By the way, my friends, are you able to hear me? Are you able to see what I'm projecting here? I just would like to know if you are able to see correctly and hear me correctly. Sometimes we have some droppings of internet that is not connected with my my home, but it can be sometimes with the platform. So, thank you, Grammy. Thank you. I just want to know if you were still there and you were able to hear me. So, muchas gracias. So, well, here you can see an image of the recreation of these processions in which the mummies were taken out from their, not necessarily tombs, from the homes where they were kept, the spaces where they were kept in a special occasion. So imagine also the Spaniards when they were seeing for the first time these ceremonies. No, that must have been like something like taken out of the their nightmares, right? But basically, we were seeing like complete different ways, perspectives of the dead and how worshipped. So here I have a question from Evelyn. How did they preserve so many? Must have been crowded. Yes, Evelyn. First of all, of course, not all of the mummies were taken in processions. They were just the mummies of the most important people. And also we know that, for example, the mummies of the Inca rulers were kept in their palaces. So there were several palaces in Cusco, for example, which was the capital of the Incas. And each of the past Inca was kept in his palace and taken care by the descendants, the direct descendants of the Inca. So it means that there was always someone taking care of the mummies. There was plenty of space, of course, for the mummies within these palaces. And the common people, probably they were, we don't know much about the cemeteries and the mummies because they were destroyed. Most of these mummies were destroyed by the extirpators of idolatries, right? So they were burned, right? Because the idea was that not permitting anymore these traditions to exist. So, but they were also kept in cemeteries or spaces which were constantly visited by their relatives, and the relatives brought food to the tombs, and we know that because there are plates that were deposited next to the mummies, right? So yes, this is the way how these cemeteries were. These were places that were constantly visited. So it's not like our concept of cemetery nowadays. Carmela, thanks for your tip support, amiga. Muchas gracias. So here also offerings, right, my friends? We have vessels. Vessels were used as part of the offerings to the gods. Food as well. We know even that they broke the vessels in little pieces, in fragments, and that was a way how they gave these presents to the gods. So it's very peculiar, this idea of destroying your effort, what it costs you, the time it costs you to create the vessels. Killing animals, sacrificing animals was also part of this important presents made to the gods. And human sacrifices. Just to make something very clear, my friends, about human sacrifices, in Peru, in the pre-Hispanic times, during the rule of the Incas, and before the Incas also, in all the societies of Peru, human sacrifices, of course, were done, but they were not something like done every day. Human sacrifices were done to young children, could be most of the time women, but also could be boys, that since very young were chosen. That is the idea of the chosen women, the chosen ones were chosen, were taken into sort of like houses, let's to make a comparison, into sort of like monasteries or convents, in which they were given a very good lifestyle and also trained for what it will come. Sometimes they were sacrificed, sometimes they were married to people, or married to the very Inca, for example, in the case of women. So this is the idea of human sacrifice, right? Not like common people were sacrificed for the gods, right? Oh, Evelyn, no worries. I'm so happy I was able to answer your question. So here we have an image taken from a series of documents, let's say, sort of like, I'm trying to find the words for describing this, like documents in images that were made by a famous chronicler from the colonial times, from the 16th century, Guamán Poma de Ayala. So Guamán Poma de Ayala was an indigenous man. That's one of the biggest differences between the regular chroniclers of the colonial period, which usually were Spaniards and priests, right? So they had a perspective of things that was very sided, no, more in the position of course, the Europeans seeing this strange world and not understanding anything, right? In the case of Guamán Poma de Ayala, here you can see the name of this chronicler. Guamán Poma was an indigenous man. We know that he was a sort of like well-educated person for being an indigenous. He made a series of drawings denouncing the treatments the Spaniards were giving to the indigenous. He was Catholic. We know this very well. So he understood the Catholic faith. Sometimes also he represents interesting images in which the indigenous are worshiping their gods and a devil is represented, like for example here, right? But at the same time, he has the understanding of how indigenous lived back then. So his drawings are usually accompanied with some writings, and the writings are in Old Spanish. So sometimes it's very hard, even for me, to understand what's there. But we have some transcripts. For example, in this one, which is in Spanish, I'm going to translate to you. It says, the great hechiceros. Hechiceros are like witchcrafts, witches, right? Inca, talking to the devil, el demonio, after consuming coca, right? So coca is the coca leaf. Of course, coca leaf is not an hallucinogenic plant at all, but we know that the Incas and pre-Inca societies use different hallucinogenic plants to talk to the gods. So they're, let's say, after drinking ayahuasca or San Pedro cactus, they were able also to connect with another world, and that's how they receive messages. First of all, this was a little introduction on how life was before the coming of the conquistadors. We had a religion that was very old, that we can even trace back to the first civilization of Peru, which is called Caral, and Caral emerged about 5,000 years ago. So we were a very old society with our own codes, our own religion, our own beliefs, and everything worked wonderfully until the coming of the conquistadors, when there was a big transformation and dramatic from one day to another transformation. So now we're going to focus in the period between 1532 and 33. Which is the time when the conquistador Pizarro comes, is the time also of the ruling of King Charles I of Spain. During that period, Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador from Trujillo de Extremadura, Trujillo of Extremadura in Spain, came to Peru, a man that was not a wealthy person. He had no noble rank. He was a very poor man, very modest man, illiterate. Also, he was an illegitimate son. So all the elements that will create, of course, a person of inferior rank in Spain. He became a soldier and also fought in Mexico and in Central America, not just, in the name of the King of Spain, also to obtain glory and fame. And that's what he finally got. Francisco Pizarro came to Peru, or started the conquest of this territory in the year 1533. And, Evelyn. And well, he got to this territory with all the desire, of course, of obtaining gold and silver, which, of course, he did greatly. And he, lived hard and died also in a terrible way, which I'm going to be explaining in a little while. So also another important person of this period of the history of Peru is Fray Vicente de Valverde. He was a Dominican friar who was with Pizarro and the conquistadors. And he was the person who also met Atahualpa, the Inca king Atahualpa. The story of the meeting of Pizarro and Atahualpa is also one of the darkest chapters in the history of the conquest of this territory, but also was the beginning of who we are, the society we are nowadays. That was it's called the Battle of Cajamarca, in which Atahualpa met Pizarro. But before meeting Pizarro, because he had this desire for long of meeting the leader of this group of bearded, fair-skinned men who recall these Huiracochas, or the son of the sun, the sons of the sun, because, they were fair, right? Fair, light-skinned. So there were mythologies in the pre-Hispanic times in which these Huiracochas, or the children of the sun, will come to these territories, right? And he was very confused. He did not know if they were gods or not. So he wanted to meet Pizarro. And Atahualpa was also involved in a difficult because there was a civil war in this territory in Peru between two half-brothers, Huáscar and him, Atahualpa. Atahualpa sort of got rid of Huáscar and was ready to take possession of all and unify his territory. But these bearded men were here already, so he wanted to know who they were, right? He knew also there were not so many. There were just a little over 100 of them in the territory. And Cajamarca in the north of Peru was the place where they finally met. Pizarro convinced Atahualpa to come to the plaza of Cajamarca with no soldiers. And probably Atahualpa believed, that was okay because there were just few Spaniards, and he probably believed they were afraid of him. So Fray Vicente Valverde was the person who first approached to the Inca, who was carried in his golden chair, in his golden litter by 18 indigenous peasants, servants of Atahualpa. So he approached to him, also accompanied with a soldier, a Spanish soldier, and a translator, and he demanded Atahualpa to convert into Catholic faith and accept as his sovereign King Charles V. So the translator tried to translate into Quechua the words of the priest, and Atahualpa, very surprised, received from the hands of Fray Vicente de Valverde the Bible. And Fray Vicente Valverde explained that in that book of God, right? So Atahualpa took the book and, with the intention of understanding, the words of God, he put the book in his ear. And he heard nothing. No, so there was no sound, no words, nothing. So what he did next, this is one of the many, let's say, chroniclers mentioning about this terrible meeting. What he did next was throwing the book to the floor, right, to the ground, to the soil. And in that moment, Fray Vicente Valverde, he and all of the Spaniards, of course, thought this was like a terrible thing, of course. No, he was offending the church, offending God. And Fray Vicente Valverde's words were to the other Spaniards, go and kill this dog full of arrogance that I absolve you. So that was the moment when the fight started. The Spaniards also were accompanied with other indigenous, and they had their arquebuses as well. They had horses, not so many, but they had enough for surprising the indigenous who were reunited in the plaza. The use of the arquebuses, the sound made by the arquebuses, and also a couple of cannons that were displayed around the plaza made this fight terrible, brutal. The indigenous had no idea where they should run. They had no idea like that what produced that terrible sound that sounded like a lightning. And well, people started to fight each other. Finally, the Inca Atahualpa ended up prisoner of the Spaniards. So this was an ambush, and the Inca never imagined something like this would happen. So he was kept prisoner for several months. We know that he learned Spanish during this period. He was very smart, by the way, Atahualpa, so far we know. And one of the things that happened is that Atahualpa knew the Spaniards were very, very eager for gold. They wanted to get gold. So he offered gold to Pizarro in exchange of his liberation. So Pizarro, of course, accepted, and this ransom of gold and silver also took some time to be finished. But unfortunately, Atahualpa realized that the more time was passing, the more gold he was given, the less important he was becoming. And he saw his end coming very, very close. So, well, as you can see, at some point, the Spaniards got lots of gold, lots of silver, but, well, Atahualpa was at that point, but not important. So what they did was, of course, making the decision of killing him. So, well, they said they were merciful for two different forms of dying. One of them was, dying as a Christian. If he died as a Christian, of course, he would go to heaven. And if he died as a Christian, he would be killed, asphyxiated, right? So the idea was that, he will be kept intact. His body will be kept intact. But if he died as a pagan, he would be burned, right? So he had two options. You could die Christian or you could die pagan. You know that for the Incas, keeping their mummy was very important. Only, the worst people of the Inca society lost their mummies or burned. So that was atrocious. That was the worst thing. So that's why he decided to convert Christian. And he died as Francisco. So the Christian name of Atahualpa was Francisco. This is the tragic story of Atahualpa. And if you want to know the charges given to him to die, the Spaniards also needed to justify the killing of Atahualpa. And he was sentenced to death for fratricide, because he ordered the death of his brother Huáscar, idolatry, of course, polygamy, of course, he had several wives. He was in all moments accompanied with 3 wives, for example, during his stay with the Spaniards. And even for hiding a treasure from the Spaniards, right? So these were the reasons of his assassination, right? So, and here, early 20th century painting of the moment of the passing of Atahualpa and his women mourning him. So after the time of the conquest of these, or let's say the settling of the Spaniards and the beginning of the Spanish power in this territory, the officialization of this Spanish power, Spanish presence was after the killing of Atahualpa. It arrived a new system in Peru for reorganizing this territory. And the way how this system was called was the encomiendas. So the encomiendas, where the translation of encomienda means to entrust, or to give land, indigenous, to a conquistador. Oh, Laura, sorry, I just noticed your comment. Sound cutting in and out. Oh, I'm so sorry. Do you still have this problem, my friends? Do you can you hear me well? Are you still receiving my voice well, or the image? Please let me know in the comments if everything is all right. Please see. Yes, can hear you well now. Oh, okay, Laura. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you. So, well, we were talking about the creation of the encomiendas, right? So the encomienda system was created even before the arrival of the Spaniards to Peru. So you know that the beginning of the conquest of this territory started in the year 1532. So in 1523, in the territory that nowadays is Mexico, the Spaniards established the encomienda system. So it was land and people entrusted or given to a conquistador, right? So the conquistadors here in America became, in a point of our history, like almighty like characters, right? They had so much power. And also, it's really interesting because many of these men were nobodies in Spain. They had no education. And not all of them were, angel souls, of course. So first you can start seeing where I'm going. So many of these people committed lots of abuses against the indigenous. So once again, an image from our indigenous chronicler Guamán Poma de Ayala, in which we can see an encomendero, right? And here a description, a couple of descriptions of what is an encomienda. So basically, let me read one of them. The encomienda was an Spanish labor system that rewarded conquistadors with the labor of certain groups of conquered non-Christian people, right? So the idea is that in exchange, the indigenous will receive Christian education. So they will be evangelized. That was the benefit the indigenous receive. Okay, so we have here, for example, this representation, this painting of a baptized of an indigenous. Something also very interesting is that the process of evangelization in Peru, talking in particular about Peru, was very successful. Yes, they're like mass baptizes happened in the first decades after the arrival of the conquistadors. Lots of indigenous started to confess, started to go to the church, but being very honest and also a little bit inquisitive, like how much an indigenous can embrace a faith so different than the one they had, in a context like the one they were living. First of all, many of the priests did not speak Quechua, so how the indigenous that only spoke Quechua could understand new faith. Also, many of these indigenous were very afraid of not becoming Catholic. So if they wanted to live normal lives, they had to be Catholic, right? And also many of them carried secretly their traditions, but outside, for the outside world, they were Catholic, right? So this is how this very fast campaign was conducted, was led, basically. How did they understand each other, Evelyn? Well, in the times of the coming of the conquistadors, we're talking about the colonial period, the early colonial period, the early viceroyalty, right? So the 16th century. First of all, you know already that the Incas spoke Quechua. That was the frank language of the indigenous at the time of the coming of the conquistadors. The conquistadors came with their language, the Spanish. So the indigenous, they were forced to understand Spanish and Quechua. Spanish and Quechua were the most used languages. Also, the priests, they needed to learn Quechua, and little by little, also the priests got very, very good at Quechua. The ones who were more in the work of evangelization, like the Dominicans and especially the Franciscans and the Jesuits, were the ones who were very, very good in Quechua, right? So we have here another image from Huamampoma. I really love the images from Huamampoma. He's fantastic. And his images, they are so profound, like they are so I don't know, they have so much life in them. So here we have the encomendero, and the encomendero is being carried in a litter. Can you see that? Right? So before the Spaniards' presence, the European presence in Peru, the only people who were carried in litters were the Incas, were the people who were descended of the gods, were the mummies, also the Malkis, and now we see the encomenderos carried everywhere by their workers. So before the coming of the conquistadors, the indigenous also worked for the Inca ruler in a system called mita. There were also different systems too. I'm not going to go like too deep into the description of each one, but the most famous is the mita. So the mita was a work for the government, in favor of the government. There was no currency in the pre-Hispanic times, meaning that the only way to pay taxes, for example, to the Inca in favor of the Inca king was with the work of people. Right? So when the Spaniards came, they realized about this system. You know, okay, the Incas, the indigenous don't have currency. They introduced the currency system, but also they took a local system, which was the mita, and they used the indigenous to work in their favor. Now the indigenous could pay with their work, their taxes. And return the protection the Spanish was given to them, and the education, the Catholic education, he was given to them. But this was a system that was abused by the Spanish at a point that indigenous were dying of extenuation, right? And nobody pretty much could control that because we were way too distant from Spain. And in Spain, to be honest, there were many good rules or intentions at least for protecting some benefits of the indigenous, but you cannot rule by remote control a territory that is so distant from you if you were a king. And the king of Spain never came to Peru, none of the kings, during the times we were a colony. So that means that there were other people who were the ones who saw this, and sometimes they decided not to spread the words of the mistreatments. That's why also Huamampoma tried to make these drawings to send them to the King Charles I. But Charles V most likely never received these chronicles. So here we have the another important time of the history of Peru, the year 1542. Right? So that was the end of the encomiendas and the privileges of the conquistadors, right? And also is the same year of the creation of the viceroyalty of Peru. So you know already that the conquistadors, they came to these territories to gain fame and fortune. Many of them had nothing to lose, and they put their own lives in risk. So let's also put in the position of the conquistadors for a moment, because, I don't like the black legends or the pink legends. We humans are good and evil all inside. We have both inside. It's our nature. So if we put in the position of the conquistadors, so they came to these territories with the only expectation of making fortunes, of like conquering these indigenous, right? And living comfortable lives, luxurious lives after that, permanently, like forever, right? And even inheriting the lands that they were conquering to their children. So that was the initial promise. That's the promise the king did to the conquistadors initially. That's why we had so many conquistadors coming here, to these lands, and many also dying in the process. So, but something happened. In the year 1542, there were new rules made, right? And these rules that say, sort of like put aside the encomiendas, took away the encomiendas from the conquistadors and created the viceroyalty. So that means that the conquistadors were no longer able to pass the land to their descendants. So they say if they died, the encomiendas will pass immediately to Spain, right? To the crown of Spain. So the conquistadors were angry, right? Like, why you're taking this away from me, right? I fought for it. People died. My relatives died. So there was a big rebellion that is called the Rebellion of the Encomenderos, and lasted for 4 years. And it was led by Gonzalo Pizarro. Gonzalo Pizarro was one of the brothers of Francisco Pizarro. Francisco Pizarro had many brothers. They were all half brothers of him. Gonzalo was one of them. And Gonzalo Pizarro also is quite a curious character of the history of Peru. Gonzalo Pizarro, he conducted this revolution in which he also ordered a viceroy to be killed. One of the viceroys who came to Peru in that period with the intention of pacifying this territory died because of his orders, and he became number one enemy of the crown of Spain. So this is why Gonzalo Pizarro at the end found his death in Lima, and his head was assassinated, was chopped off, and was exposed also in a stick in the middle of the main square of the city. His death was an exemplar death, and was, very important to be made like this, so nobody would stand up again against the crown of Spain in the way he did. This was the way how Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of Francisco Pizarro, died. So I'm trying to give you the frame, the frame of the story of Taki Oncoy with all of these elements I'm sharing. So also the participation of the Dominican and Franciscan priests in the 16th century was fundamental for the good and for the bad. In the case of, the bad, sort of like connections we have between these revolutions and the way how the indigenous were mistreated by monks, it's also something I have to share with you. And here you can see, for example, this representation in which we see again another image of Wamampoma, a priest. Always when you see a person with this hat you see over here, it refers to a priest, to a monk, to a padre. That's the way how we call priest here in Latin America. And here we can see a woman that is in an obraje. Obraje is the work, the labor center where she is weaving for the priest. This is also the way how the encomiendas were conducted, because remember, the encomenderos could be sometimes the conquistadors, and sometimes also could be religious orders. So she is being beaten or mistreated by this priest. But remember, no, we had also very good priests in the times of the colonial times, people who really fought for in favor of the indigenous, who fought for their rights, who fought them to be seen as equal with the Spaniards, at least in the sense of in the best sense of that period. Of course, they were not exactly the same, but they had souls. Some priests believed they had souls, that they could be saved, that they could go to heaven, that they could learn, and they had the right of learning. So, well, we had this type of priest, and we have also the priests that were very mean to the indigenous. For example, here, this is a section, this is a section that is in Old Spanish. This is what I really like about these images of Guamán Poma, in which we can see Old Spanish, right? And here we see the translation into modern Spanish. So I'm going to translate it into English. It says, muy bravo, like very, very angry, muy bravo, colérico, like a choleric, angry father, priest, against the caciques principales. Cacique is sort of like the leader, the indigenous leaders, which were the ones who responded by the other indigenous of the community. And here we have another one in which we can see the maltratamiento or mistreatments, mistreatments of the corregidores, the ones who corrected the indigenous. For example, here, the priest, again, we can see the hat over here, right, towards a woman, and also a man that is bleeding also in the floor. So Guamán Poma probably was able even to witness these actions, and also that's why he made most of these drawings to tell the king of Spain what was happening here in Peru, because he believed the Spaniards were not transmitting the real situation to the king. But unfortunately, his documents, this manuscript he did, ended up somehow in Copenhagen. So this is probably, let's say, a proof that these documents never went to the king. So we have here now, finally, at the end, the Taki Oncoy and the movement, this messianic movement. A messianic movement is a movement that has sort of like a messiah, a god, a spiritual entity, a supernatural creature that conducts the movement. So it's not just ideological. It's fundamented in the beliefs, in the faith, in the religion. Remember, Taki Ongoy means the disease of the dance. And there are many interpretations about that. First of all, a spiritual disease that was making indigenous feeling sick, feeling sad, feeling depressed. So this emerging of the movement started in the South Andes of Peru. This is an Andean, let's say, movement that is spread from Lima in direction to Bolivia, even reaching out La Paz, right? So many cities like Cusco, Arequipa, for example, had a strong influence of the Taki Oncoy movement. This movement started around the year 1561 and continued until the year 1572. In this period of the Taki Oncoys, which were also the priests. So the Taki Oncoy is the movement, and the Taki Oncoys are also, this name is referred to the priests who were continuing with the old tradition, the ancient tradition that probably they received from their fathers, their grandfathers, of, let's say, wakas or priests. Maybe you remember about in the beginning about the different priests we had. So they wanted to continue with these traditions, and the reason why these people were continuing with these traditions or trying to bring back these traditions from their ancestors that in this point of our history were completely banned, because let's remember that these were forbidden traditions. Now we are in the colonial times when other religions were not permitted. The reason was fundamented in the fact that the colonial period also was a time of diseases. There were many new diseases that were coming with the conquistadors, with the Spaniards, like smallpox, for example, like fever, like flu, diseases that did not existed here in Peru before the Spaniards. So the indigenous believed that these diseases were not, in fact, like introduced by the Spaniards. No, that these diseases were punishments from their gods because they were forgetting their gods, right? The indigenous were forgetting their gods. So it was a punishment from their gods. And they were trying with these dances, with these ceremonies, to go back with these gods and ask these gods forgiveness, right? So there were frenetic dances and movements, and probably the intake of hallucinogenic plants in the same way how it used to be done in the times before the Spaniards, right? But also there were conditions to be part of the Taki Oncoy. One of the conditions was that you should not be baptized Catholic. If you were baptized Catholic, if you were Christian, you were not suiting for joining this movement, right? Because you were already part of the Spaniards' belief. So for the ones who kept clean from these new beliefs that was coming, they were the ones suiting to join this tradition. Probably eventually there were people who were baptized Catholic who wanted to go to unite this movement and were eventually accepted, but the movement lasted for a little bit over a decade, so it couldn't go any farther. But it was a very important resistance group. It was the group that resisted the most, actually, in that period. So here we have another image from Huamán Poma de Ayala of a place where the movement was born. It is called Huancavelica, and Huancavelica is a mining zone even nowadays. Back then, also very important mining zone because it is rich in a very important mineral, in mercury. So mercury was very important for the extraction of gold, but mercury is very toxic, very, very toxic. So the indigenous of this location were exposed to be in contact of mercury constantly. This is where the Taki Oncoy movement started. And here you can see another image from Huamán Poma, in which we have a representation of a woman which is dancing. This is also referring to the Taki Oncoy, to these ceremonies. Huamán Poma also lived during the time when the Taki Oncoy existed. So he portrayed this woman that is, like beating or is playing this musical instrument, this drum. And we have a man over here vomiting, and we have a demon on top, right? So saying sort of like the devils are leading these people into these ceremonies and also making them feel sick, and they are processing their spirits. The belief was, even until nowadays, is that these ceremonies also involve use of hallucinogenic plants, and that's why people were vomiting during these ceremonies, or they were like trembling or shaking during these ceremonies. And this is the most characteristic part of the movement Taki Oncoy. Also, I added here an image about the punishments, the castigos, the punishments that the indigenous received during this period, when the ones who were working in the service of the Spaniards, in the mita, in the mines also, how they were punished, how they were treated. So you can see, for example, the corregidor, the person that is correcting these indigenous, and here you can see the indigenous, which are terribly mistreated. So if these images are very shocking, imagine being witness of something like that in real life, like of this punishment in particular, for example. No, what a terrible time of the history of Peru. This one of the early conquest. So he had an important person related with this movement. He was sort of like the leader, considered the leader of the Taki Oncoy, of this revolution, which is also a hero at some point of this movement, Juan Chocne. Juan Chocne was the person who organized the indigenous. He was not a descendant of the Incas, although he was a very important leader, probably like a curaca, or in Central America would be called cacique, right? So he was a leader with certain level of education, but we are not sure more about him. There's really not much information about Juan Chocne. And Juan Chocne, unfortunately, was finally imprisoned. He was taken prisoner by the Spaniards, probably after a very strong campaign in the Andes to find him, to find the Taki Oncoys, to find the people who were behind all of this movement and resistance, because the Spaniards really eventually they were very afraid of this movement, of what they could achieve. So finally he was taken prisoner. We know that he was taken to Cusco. We know that he was publicly ashamed. His hair was cut, for example, which was a really bad way of punishment in the times against the indigenous. And we don't know really much about him later. Probably he died in the hands of the Spaniards, but the information about Juan Chocne is not very clear. So that happened in the year 1571. Also, that is the time of other resistance, and probably in the next event I'm going to be talking about this, the puppet kings, the puppet Inca kings that ruled Peru after the coming of the conquistadors. There were several Inca kings we had in this period since the coming of the conquistadors and the death of Atahualpa in the year 1532, until the complete falling of the Inca dynasty in the year 1572. So we are seeing several years, of course, of resistance of the Incas. And, well, I'm sure you would like to hear more about these other Incas in another event. So Juan Chocne, the Taki Oncoy, also coexisted with this fight of Incas against the Spaniards in other flank in the Andes, very close to the jungle. But this was more like a military fight. The other one was an ideological fight. So there were different kinds of fights in that period. But unfortunately, the story ends tragically always for the indigenous, because all of these revolutions were mitigated by the Spanish. Unfortunately, Peru was very fragmented back then. There were also many different indigenous groups. There were many different, positions about the Spaniards. Not everybody was against the Spaniards. You might be wondering, why the indigenous did not stand it against the Spaniards. We were bigger numbers. It is because Peru was already fragmented before the Spanish arrival. We were in a civil war, and there were also numerous groups in Peru. They were not all cohesive. They were not the same. So that's why some of them decided to support the Spaniards and become Catholics and embrace the new traditions, right? Nowadays, we Peruvians are the children of the Spaniards and the children of the Incas. We cannot see ourselves as just children of Incas or children of the Spaniards. Our culture is very rich because, well, at the end, we receive both influences. One forced, the other was local, indigenous, ours, right? One was forced, but eventually our culture nowadays is the product of a forced marriage between these two worlds. So a final analysis to finish this event about the Taki Oncoy, and this is going to be surprising, I'm sure, for you all. Was the Taki Oncoy a real disease, my friends? Well, recently, thanks to the analysis of different archaeologists, and especially the analysis of the bodies of people buried in the context of the Taki Oncoy, and also the proximity of these locations to especially mining zones where there's mercury, and also the notes of the Spanish chroniclers about this, the way how the people who participated of the Taki Oncoy look like, how they behave, that also gave us a really clear understanding of another phenomena that was happening in the physiques of these people. They were not just being possessed by huacas, by the gods. They were poisoned. Oh, gracias, Laura. Thank you so much for your support, amiga. They were poisoned. They were poisoned with mercury. All of these tremors, these shakings, these movements, this extenuation, this sadness. Many of these indigenous were mistreated because they were always extenuated. And the Spaniards treated them very, very bad and beat them very bad. And they had no idea why they were not responding to their work. And now we know that probably they were all sick because of the mercury, the exposure of the mercury. For example, in this part of a chronicler, from the year 1564, in which, well, it's in Spanish, it's in all Spanish. I cannot translate literally into English, but I will take some parts of this document just to give you an idea of what was the impression of the Spaniards about the indigenous. For example, it says that hacían hablar y de allí tomaron a temblar. So they were trembling, saying that the huacas, diciendo que las huacas están en el cuerpo. They were in their bodies. So they were trembling, they were shaking. They could not control that. But they believed it was their gods that were taking their bodies, possessing their bodies, right? And this was sort of like the response of the gods against their mistreatments, because the indigenous were not. So let's do a little analysis of the different, let's say, symptoms these indigenous were having. For example, gingivitis, they were losing teeth, they were losing the saliva, right? They were having also problems for talking, the dysarthria, which is also called the singing disease, right? They were having some muscle fatigue. They were having ataxia or tremors in their body, right? So they couldn't control their movements, right? They were also having other problems, like, for example, gracias, Mari, thank you. For example, they say a deterioration, of their psyche. They were sort of like going mad. They were feeling depression. They were irritable. They were having problems for sleeping, sleep apnea, and so many other symptoms, so, which is very tragic. They were, of course, connecting all of this with a spiritual disease. That's why also Taki Oncoy is the disease of the dance. They were trying to purify their bodies, dancing and praising their gods, right? But at the end, what I want also to share with you is that these people were taking these dances or these expressions as an excuse for letting out the rage they had inside, for all of these abuses they were receiving, right? But this resistance of the indigenous still exists nowadays in different forms, because we were able to resist. And how we were able to resist, sort of like converting the faith, our traditions, our pre-Hispanic traditions, into something more suiting, like with Catholic appearance, for not having any problems with the Spaniards, but also at the same time, also being able to continue practicing our faith in disguise, right? For example, we have the Caesar's dance, the dance of the Caesars, or the dancers of the Caesars, which are, for example, people that, like this gentleman here in the picture, they dance also doing contortions and acrobatic movements. The origin of the dancers of the Caesars, or the Caesar dance, is connected with the Taki Oncoy. We know that because of these movements and these tremblings and these shakings, right, were some for them connected with expressions of the wakas and the gods in their bodies. There were also priests who moved and shake, and possibly by drinking hallucinogenic plants were able to do contortions. And for example, here we have a drawing from the 19th century about the Caesar dancers in the Andes, and how they are shaking and they are moving and they are doing these contortions and they're doing acrobatic movements. Nowadays, we continue having the Caesar dancers, and this is a tradition of Peru, which is also patrimony of the country. If you have the chance, please give a look to Caesar's dance in Google later after this event finish. You're going to be fascinated with the capacity of these acrobats to perform these dances. Also, well, not just the Caesar's dance, or we have the ceremonies about the Pachamama to respect the Mother Earth. We continue with these traditions that are nowadays part of our life, and there's no conflict between Catholic beliefs and the indigenous beliefs. Now we have united, we have melted both, and somehow we are able to make them coexist with no problems. Nowadays also the church has decided to, permit these activities and not being so judgmental, not being so picky about them. So we have created a new version of Catholic faith, which is the one we have now. And I close this event with this image here, and the story that is here. It is in Spanish, but I'm going to translate it to you. Is a story of resistance as well. So after the terrible crimes committed by the Christians in Santo Domingo, that's the island of Cuba, the cacique Hatuey was able to escape and organize a resistance in Cuba. He was persecuted and made prisoner, right? So he was condemned to die, burned in the stake, atado or tied strongly to a post. When the fires started to touch his body, burn him, a priest got close to him to make him Christian before dying. Hatuey asked if he became Christian, he would go to the heaven of the Christians. The priest said that yes, of course. So Hatuey answered that he preferred to go to hell than seeing a Christian again. So this was the impression that this curaca had of the Christians, that they were the worst. So and it was not because of the Word of God, not because of Jesus Christ. It was the way how these Spaniards were behaving, were conducting themselves, and the message that they were given back in that time was not really the one that the Bible was carrying, right? So anyways, this is the story of one of these many men who died, who preferred to die non-Christian than seeing a Christian again in the afterlife. So anyways, thank you so much for your participation, my friends. Here are some sources of this event if you want to know about where I was able to get the information for this event. Here you have some links. This information is in Spanish, so please, if you want to practice your Spanish, go to these links. That would be super great. And as you know, every time I do these events, I do something different. So next time you see the Untold History on, it means that there's going to be something completely different, okay? So I invite you all also to my next event next week. I'm going to be talking about a mystery of Peru, the mysterious engraved stones of Ica. So please don't miss out. It's going to be next week, and I'm going to be doing it in 2 different slots in the same day. Here, all my information, my contacts. Thank you so much for your tip support, my friends. It helped me a lot. It helped a lot this channel to continue bringing information of this kind. Always stories that are very difficult to be found in YouTube or in internet. I love history. So what I try to do is share with you things that are very unique, untold. Well, I hope you enjoy this content. And also this Saturday, I'm going to I will be going to Pride. So if you would like to go to Pride in Lima with me, it's going to be this Saturday. I want to tell you the history of the LGBTQ community in Peru, how is being part of this community in Peru, and also in what state they are on, their fights for gaining, let's say, the possibility of getting married in Peru or adopting kids in Peru. So we're going to talk about this also on Saturday. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you can to my channel and activate the bell for receiving notifications every time I upload a new video. I am uploading videos every week, and all of them are about history or street city tours. Sometimes I do cooking classes, so please don't forget to subscribe. If you want to adopt me and this channel and become a supporter of this YouTube channel, well, you can do it on Patreon. That is a really nice alternative. You can adopt me for a month, a couple of months, or if you wish permanently there. So I'm going to be leaving the link to access to my Patreon here in the description of the video as well. Also, you can support me during my live events on Hago with a tip, a little donation. Everything is highly appreciated. So thank you so much. Please follow my social medias. They are going to be appearing somewhere here in the screen in this moment. I would love to chat with you and get to know you more. So, well, see you in the next video. Soon I'm going to be doing an event about the mysterious carved stones of Incas. So if you like mysteries, that video is for you. Well, see you soon. Take care and bye-bye.